It was just another Tuesday morning. Same desk, same coffee, same endless list of emails I was pretending to care about. My phone was face down beside my keyboard, buzzing every now and then with work notifications. But then there it was, that one call that didn't belong in the middle of a workday. My cousin's name lit up the screen. At first I thought maybe it was just a quick check-in or some family gossip. I almost didn't pick up, but something in me knew. Been wrong. Her voice was shaky, almost like she was holding her breath to keep it together. She's gone. That's all she said. I swear, for a second, everything around me stopped. The tapping of keyboards, the hum of the air conditioner, it all faded into this heavy, unbearable silence. My mind went blank. I just stared at my screen, my cursor blinking at me like it was waiting for me to respond. Grandma, the woman who practically raised me. The one person in the family who could calm a storm just by making you a cup of tea, gone. I don't remember much about the next. A few minutes just standing up, walking out into the hallway. My phone pressed against my ear while my cousin talked through the details. Flights, funeral arrangements, who's driving from where. My brain was split in two, half grieving, half trying to make a checklist, so I didn't fall apart completely. The first person I called after hanging up was my supervisor. I was still on autopilot then, keeping my voice steady, almost formal. I told him what happened, that I'd need to be gone for 4 days. And you know what? He sounded human, of course. Take the time you need, he said. There was even this little pause in his voice, like he genuinely felt bad for me. I almost thanked him for being decent, which feels ridiculous now. I hung up, sat down at my desk, and just stared at the wall. For days, that's all I had to say goodbye. But at least I thought, work was sorted. At least I didn't have to worry about that. If I had known what was coming, maybe I would have taken a little longer in that moment, let myself feel it instead of rushing through. But at the time, I thought the hard part was losing her. I was wrong. Those next 4 days didn't feel like real time. They were slow, and yet somehow gone in an instant. The moment I stepped off the bus and saw my family waiting for me, it was like my chest finally let go of all that air I'd been holding in since the call. We didn't even speak at first, just stood there, holding on to each other like the ground might disappear. The house felt different without her. It smelled the same, like cardamom and the faint trace of lavender soap, but there was this emptiness, the kind you can't fill with people or food or background noise. Every corner of the house was a memory. The chipped mug she always used for her tea, the Afghan blanket she kept draped over the back of her chair, the faint rattle of the back window when the wind picked up. She used to joke it was the house sighing, and in the middle of all of it, the planning, the phone calls, the back and forth about flowers, caskets, food for after the service. I kept my hands busy because the second I stopped, the weight of it all would come crashing in. There were moments when I'd catch myself expecting to hear her in the kitchen banging pots, humming that same tune she'd never finished. I'd turn the corner and remember. I'm 12 years old, sitting at her kitchen table with a plate of her fried bread in front of me. She's telling me, Ogun, that life isn't about the big wins. It's about showing up every day. I remember rolling my eyes thinking it was just another one of her old people's sayings. But now, God, I'd give anything to hear her say it one more time. The funeral itself was quiet. No dramatic wailing, no chaos. Just the sound of people shuffling in and out, murmured condolences, and the occasional break in someone's voice. Black coats, white flowers, that smell of rain, that always comes after a long, heavy night. Work felt like another life, like something that belonged to another version of me. My phone stayed in my bag, on silent, buried under tissues and folded obituary papers. For those 4 days, there was no office, no deadlines, no emails, just this. A small bubble of grief I couldn't step out of. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was here, letting go of her, something was already shifting back at work, quietly and not in my favor. Walking back into work after those 4 days felt wrong, like I'd been gone for months, not days. The building was the same chipped tile. In the lobby, same hum of the fluorescent lights, but it felt colder. I thought maybe I'd get a few sorry for your loss or a pat on the shoulder. Not that I was craving attention, but something. Anything that acknowledged the fact that my life had shifted while theirs kept going. Instead, it was quiet. Too quiet. A couple of coworkers glanced up from their desks, gave me quick, tight smiles, and went right back to whatever they were doing. No, eye contact that lasted more than a second. It wasn't unfriendly exactly, just awkward, like I was walking in with something contagious. I made my way to the break room, hoping a cup of coffee would settle me. The machine hissed and dripped. In the corner, filling the room with that bitter, burnt smell. I stood there, watching the stream of coffee fill my cup, and realized I hadn't seen my supervisor yet. Normally, he'd be at his desk by now, or pacing around with that "I'm too busy to sit" look he liked to wear. But nothing. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he was in a meeting, maybe he'd pop. By later still, the air felt different. Not hostile, just charged. On the way back to my desk, I caught snippets of hushed conversation to people whispering near the copier, someone lowering their voice when I walked by. Grief has this strange way of making you hypersensitive to everything. Every glance, every tone shift feels amplified. I tried to shake it off, focus on my inbox. But my mind kept drifting. I didn't know it yet, but the welcome back I thought I'd get wasn't coming. And neither was the sympathy I assumed was just basic human decency. It was around 10:15. When my phone buzzed, not my personal one, the work desk phone, I glanced at the little display. Supervisor's extension. For half a second, I thought maybe this was the moment. The "hey, welcome back, sorry for your loss" talk. The human moment. I picked up, said hello. His voice was flat. "Can you come to my office?" "Not could you not, when you have a minute." "Just come." His office was on the far end of the hall, blinds half drawn, so the sunlight cut across the floor in harsh strips. He didn't look up when I stepped inside, just pointed at the chair across from his desk. I sat, waiting for the usual. Small talk, but it never came. He leaned back in his chair, fingers laced over his stomach, and started speaking like he was reading off a script. "We can't tolerate unplanned absences in your position. Fortunately, we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." For a moment, I honestly thought I misheard him. My ears were still ringing from the way he said it, so casual, like he was telling me my coffee order was out of stock. I reminded him slowly, carefully, that I'd told him about my grandmother's passing, that I'd called him, that he'd approved the 4 days off. He shifted in his chair, looked down at some papers on his desk, and said, "I understand, but this isn't about that. It's about attendance policies." His eyes never met mine. It was the kind of answer you give when you've already decided there's no conversation to be had. Cold, hollow, practiced. The room felt smaller with every second. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on his wall, the sound of someone typing in the office next door. My hands clenched on the armrest of the chair without me realizing it. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation that made sense, but my voice came out quieter than I expected. "You told me to take the time." We didn't even flinch. Just repeated something about company needs and moving forward. And just like that, it was over. For years of work, of showing up early, of covering for other people's mistakes, wiped out in a 10-minute conversation with someone who couldn't even look me in the eye. I don't remember standing up from that chair. One second, I was sitting there, gripping the armrests. The next, I was back at my desk, pulling my things together, while my hands shook. It's strange how quickly your world can shrink into a cardboard box. A coffee mug I'd bought on my first day. A framed photo of me and my grandma at the county fair. A stack of sticky notes covered in half-finished doodles from boring meetings. For years of showing up early, staying late, covering for sick coworkers, and it all fit in one box. I kept my head down as I walked out, avoiding eye contact. The few people who did look up quickly looked away, like they didn't want to be caught seeing me like this. Was the same look people give when passing a wreck on the side of the road. Grief was still sitting heavy in my chest from the funeral, but now it had accompanied anger, disbelief. And underneath it all, this gnawing voice whispering that maybe I'd done something wrong. Was I naive to trust him? Should I have gotten everything in writing? Did I miss some warning signs before I left? That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't just hurt you. It makes you question yourself. Like maybe you deserved it, somehow. Outside, the sunlight was too bright, making me squint as I walked to my car. It should have been a relief, leaving the building behind, but instead it felt like being pushed out of somewhere I'd worked so hard to belong. I set the box in the passenger seat and just sat there for a while, hands gripping the steering wheel. The coffee mug inside rattled with the sound of my breathing. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about the fact that I'd trusted someone when I was at my most vulnerable, and they'd used that moment to take something from me. A couple of days after it happened, barely left the house. I told myself I was taking time to process, but really I was just sitting in the dark. Scrolling through my phone like maybe the right answer would appear in a notification, and then little pieces started showing up. A text from a coworker. "I'm so sorry. I heard what happened. I'm not supposed to say this, but he's been looking for someone to cut for months." Another message from someone in accounting. "It's about budget. You weren't the only name on the list, but you were the easiest. The easiest." That word hit me harder than I expected. I started piecing it together through half-whispered phone calls and late-night texts. My approved leave? Maybe it wasn't approval at all. Maybe it was bait, clean, convenient way to tick a name off the payroll without the mess of performance warnings or drawn-out paperwork. The more I learned, the more the grief I'd been drowning in started boiling into something else. This wasn't just bad timing. This wasn't unfortunate policy. This was deliberate, and the part that stung the most. It picked me because I wouldn't fight it, because I'd walk out quietly, box in hand, without making a scene. Sitting in my living room, the only light coming from my phone screen, I replayed every conversation I'd had with him, every time I'd stayed late to help on a deadline, every time I'd stepped in to cover for someone else, and I couldn't shake the thought, maybe he'd been smiling through all of it. Knowing exactly how little it would matter in the end, there's only so much sitting in the dark a person can do. After a while, the silence starts to feel less like mourning and more like surrender. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how he must have gone home after firing me, probably had dinner, maybe watched TV without a second thought. And that's when something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let this slide. The grief was still there, sharp and heavy, but now it had company, a purpose. And for the first time in weeks, I felt awake. I started digging. Old emails, saved voicemails, calendar invites. I found the message where I told him about my grandmother passing. I found the reply where he said, "Take the time you need." I replayed the voicemail where he confirmed my leave. Over and over, then came the texts from coworkers, the ones who'd been too scared to speak up in public. Their words were cautious, but clear, enough to show a pattern, enough to connect the dots. I bought a cheap USB drive from the corner store and started moving everything over. File after file, screenshot after screenshot, each one a small victory. I labeled the folder evidence in all caps like I was, daring anyone to challenge it. The more I gathered, the more the power started shifting. I wasn't just the quiet, grieving employee who'd been blindsided anymore. I was the person who could prove exactly what happened. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about balance. It's about making sure that, for once, someone else had to sit in that same cold. It's a small room, an answer for what they'd done. The HR office was exactly what you'd expect, white walls, sterile lighting, a faint smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on a hot plate, 2 chairs, 1 table, a clipboard waiting in the middle like a prop in a bad play. I sat down, my USB drive in my pocket, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The HR rep, "Let's call her," Linda smiled, that professional, "Nothing's wrong" smile. "So, I understand you wanted to discuss your recent termination?" I didn't bother with small talk. I pulled out the drive, slid it across the table, and said, "Everything you need to see is on there." Her smile faltered a little, but she plugged it into her laptop. I sat there, watching her face as she opened the folder labeled evidence. First, The email then, the voicemail recording of my supervisor's voice. Take the time you need. Then, the messages from coworkers, talking about how he'd been planning cuts for months. Each click of the mouse felt louder than the last. The room seemed to shrink as the air between us got heavier. By the time she finished, she wasn't smiling anymore. She leaned back, folded her hands, and exhaled. This, serious. There was no way to spin it, no policy line she could hide behind. The evidence was too clear, too damning. My so-called unplanned absence had been approved verbally, in writing, and corroborated by witnesses. And the only reason I was out of a job was because it was convenient for him. She promised they'd investigate immediately. Her tone had changed, less scripted, more careful. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt the balance shift. The truth was out, and it was no longer just my problem. The call came a week later. I almost didn't pick up a known number, middle of the afternoon, but something told me to answer. It was Linda from HR. Her voice was different this time. No corporate script, no slow, careful pacing, just straightforward. The investigation is complete. We want to formally apologize for the way this was handled. She went on to explain that I'd be receiving compensation enough to cover the months I'd lost, plus a little more for the inconvenience. I had to bite back a laugh at that word, inconvenience, as if losing your job in the middle of grieving was a mild hiccup. But the real news came. Next. The supervisor in question is no longer with the company. I didn't ask if he was fired, or if they let him resign. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he wouldn't be doing this to someone else. When I hung up, I didn't feel the rush of victory I'd imagined. No adrenaline, no dramatic movie ending, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something heavy finally stops pressing on your chest. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, sunlight spilling through in long, warm streaks. Steam rose from my mug, curling into the air like it had nowhere urgent to be. It wasn't about winning. It was about setting something right. And in that moment, I felt lighter. It took a little time, but I found a new job. Smaller company. Fewer perks on paper, but the kind of place where people actually look you in the eye when they talk to you. Where how are you? It's a real question, not a line before they hand you more work. And the thing is, I'm happier here. Not because the work is easier, it isn't, but because I know I'm surrounded by people who mean what they say. Looking back, I can see how much I'd been holding on to that old job like it was proof of who I was. The title, the routine, the sense of being needed. But grief has a way of stripping all of that away, forcing you to see what's real and what's just decoration. Losing my grandmother hurt in a way I still can't fully put into words. Losing my job right after felt like salt in the wound. But now, I can see it for what it was. The ending of something that was already cracked at the foundation. Learn that respect for yourself, your time, your boundaries matters more than any company logo on your business card. And that sometimes walking away, even if you're pushed, can be the first step towards somewhere better. One morning, a few weeks into my new role, I caught my reflection in a shop window on the way to work. I didn't look tense, or guarded, or braced for impact. Just me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.